Okay, so I'm Patrick Crowley. I want to talk a little bit about Haml and Sass, specifically doing Haml and Sass or learning Haml and Sass in 15 minutes. First, what are Haml and Sass? Definitely a common question. Basically, they're templating languages. Haml is for HTML, and Sass is for CSS. You can use them individually, so you can just use Haml or just use Sass, or you can use them both. If you're starting to learn Haml and Sass, I would just, learn Haml first. That's really the one that has kind of more meat on the bones. I mean, Sass is fun, but there's not that much to it. So when I mention Haml and Sass, this is what I get a lot. I get kind of like, why do I need to learn another markup language for doing this sort of stuff? Well, the answer is you do need to do it and get over it because Haml is really cool. And ERB is not especially cool. So this summer, as you guys know, I was in Australia hanging out with the Sydney Ruby and Rails group. And this really kind of funny guy there, Max Merman, kept saying Haml is poetry with this kind of thick German accent. And that really kind of sunk in. Because he's sort of right. So Haml's kind of designed around a couple principles, and they are that markup should be beautiful. And I think often when we build web apps, markup is not beautiful, and it's kind of a afterthought, and users don't care about it, so why should I? But there's something to be said, I think, for spending a little bit of effort keeping your views nice and clean, the same way you continually refactor your methods, in your model or controllers. You should do the same in your views. Markup should be dry, so you don't want to be repetitive. So where you are repetitive, try to clean that up. Markup should be well indented. We do that because it shows us kind of what the structure of the document is, and that's important just because even if you're just looking at the source of your app, you want to kind of know what's there and see what's going on. And if you remember, a couple of years ago when no one really did web standards design and we all used tables and you looked at your code, it didn't matter how smart you were. You didn't really know what was going on. So let's start with some basics of Haml. It's white space active. So, the first tip is not to use tabs, or you will go crazy. And indentation in your markup equals structure. And I'll explain that a little bit more. You can kind of see that through the examples I have. Tags begin with a % sign. So not a left angle or right angle bracket, but just % and then whatever the tag is. Tags close themselves. So unlike, regular HTML or ERB, you're not constantly, opening and closing tags. You just write the basic tag with the % sign in front of it. And if you have, a set of attributes for a particular tag, you use a hash, Ruby hash for that. So let's start with this example. This is just HTML. This is a headline. The contents of it are Haml is cool. And let's go ahead and look at this in Haml. So just to go back, that's the HTML, and this is the Haml equivalent. So we have, the h1 tag, so %h1, then a space, and then whatever the value of the h1 tag is. Pretty easy. So let's kind of take that further. Let's say we want to have some dynamic stuff going on in there. This might be the output we start with. If we did this in ERB, it might look like this. So you'd have the headline tag, the first part that wasn't dynamic, and then some kind of interpolated value, which in this case is the name of the person that I'm addressing, and then the close tag for the h1. So if I re-express this in Haml, it looks like that. So you have the tag up front, %h1, then equals so that it evaluates what comes after it. And you just have a standard string with, the name value inserted in there. So here's another one. Let's say we have a div with an ID of color, and the contents of that are red. I do see a little bug there, as you guys probably do. I think I will fix this on the fly, just because. Hey, yeah, that's easier. All right. So, moving on. So if we express this in Hamel, our first pass might look something like this. Okay, we've got a div tag, so we do %div, and then we have an ID of color, and so we kind of steal a little bit from the syntax of CSS, and we say #color. And then lastly, we have the value of that whole thing, which is red. But there's actually kind of a nice little thing about Hamel, which is if you don't specify a tag, it assumes, that you're talking about a div. So we've kind of gone from writing this, to writing that, which is just a lot simpler. And so in this particular example, you might say, well, gee, I'm only saving, 10 or 15 characters. But, multiply that times every line of code in all of your views, and it's going to add up pretty fast. So next up, let's look at how Hamel might handle a loop. So here's a traditional ERB view. We have a unordered list of friends. So we start with the top. We kind of set up the list. Then we've got a little kind of loop through the friends that we have, and for each friend we're going to print out a new list element with the value of the friend's name inserted, and then we're going to end that whole thing, and then finally we're going to end the list itself. So that's what that looks like in Hamel, which is way cleaner. So we have the unordered list. Actually, I messed that one up. So. Actually, did I? All right, so it's an unordered list. The ID is friends, and then we're just literally looping through each friend, and we're outputting a list element that evaluates to the name of the friend for each part of the list. And this would be the output that you get. One nice thing that Hamel does is it sort of automatically reflects the indentation that you have in your code. So you're always going to get really nice indented output for everything you do. So let's look at some attributes. So back to the same example. It's slightly incorrect, but you get the idea. It actually auto-closes loops, which is another nice thing because you don't really need to think about that as much. Yes. So in this case, we want to add a class of list to our list, sort of redundant, if you want to be semantic about it. But we're just doing this to kind of show you how you might pass, a number of IDs or classes to a tag. So when this outputs, you get the friend's ID you had before, plus a list class attached to the unordered list element. So let's look at some forms. This is a fair amount of code, so unfortunately it can't be bigger on screen, but basically I have a comment form here. And first of all, it's checking to see whether or not I'm logged in as a user. And then if I am logged in, it's going to show me the form itself, which is sort of a RESTful form that's using the form for helper. And the, text, it's generating a, label and a text area and a submit tag. And then if I'm not logged in, I'll get a link to log in. So we're going to take this, which is now ERB, and transform it into Hamel. So you can see it's definitely quite a bit smaller. I mean, forms are still relatively complex as markup goes, and they tend to have a lot of junk in them. But if you kind of go back and forth here and really compare the two, you can really see how Hamel's kind of highlighting the stuff that matters versus the stuff that doesn't matter. And it's kind of doing a lot of stuff for you sort of auto-magically, so you're really focused on... say again?
Why do you have an equal sign?
Why do I?
Yeah.
Okay, well in this case we're using the form for helper, right? So we need to evaluate that, right? So it's going to run that and then spit out the resulting HTML. The submit tag? Yes, because if you look at what those were, right, it kind of maps to ERB, so where you use equal for the output, you'd use the same thing there. All right, so let's look at layouts, another kind of common one. So here's a typical ERB layout, might be application or something like that. So you've got your head, you've got some meta stuff. I've got a couple things from my headliner and styler plugins in there. And then I've got, once you're inside the body of this layout, you've got whether or not I'm logged in. It's kind of showing me a little message if I'm logged in. I've got a flash there, and then finally I'm yielding the output before I finish up the page. So if I re-express this in Hamel, this is what you get. So the nice thing is Hamel has some helpers for generating things like doc types and HTML attributes, things that you do on every single application, but you really almost never change unless you think, okay, well, this app's going to be transitional or this app's going to be strict. But other than that, you're not really going to write anything new there ever. But again, kind of comparing the two, you're really kind of seeing the actual stuff that's there, that's important, versus all the kind of extraneous markup junk that you normally get in HTML or in ERB.
A couple screens before that.
Yeah?
Yeah, that one. Right there. There's no minus in front of the if on that one. Is that a mistake or is that?
That is a mistake.
Okay.
Thank you. So there should be a minus in front of the if.
I was wondering what the rule was.
Logged in. Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, so that's kind of the basics of Hamel. I mean, there are a couple more edge case things, but that's enough to get started, I think, for a lot of apps. Let's look at Sass for a second. So the basic syntax for that, here's a normal sort of snippet of CSS. I've got a box ID selector, then I'm setting the border, and I'm setting the color of the text. And if I convert this to Sass, this is what it would look like at first blush. So, I lose the curly brackets, I lose the semicolons, and it's just a lot simpler. And again, I'm using kind of indentation to indicate that the attributes are part of the selector that's declared. There's another more common style people use for Sass. It feels a little more Ruby-like, which is this next slide. So these look really like symbols, and we're declaring values for them. It's kind of weird to go write a lot of Sass this way and then go back to CSS. You really get confused, and I don't have a great answer for that. But I will say it's kind of nice to write, Ruby-like code everywhere in your application versus just certain parts of it. So I personally prefer this syntax. Sass has some nice stuff for nesting of styles. So taking the same example of the box with the border and color set, I now want to kind of extend this to have a box with a class of orange have a border that's orange. So this is the Sass I would write, and this is what it generates. So, if you've written a lot of stuff, of this kind of stuff yourself, you have to kind of declare box over and over and over and over again, and that gets kind of to be a pain. So Sass kind of does this stuff for you. It also actually nests each subsequent style that you do. So when you're actually looking at your output as your final CSS, it's going to be a little more legible. And that's actually something you can customize. There are, I think, 3 or 4 different output styles that Sass has that you can choose depending on what your style is. If you like to have your CSS all kind of declared on one single line with all the attributes in one long horizontal row, you can do that. And there are a couple other things as well. So Sass also has support for variables in your CSS. There definitely have been a couple other tools out there that do this sort of thing. I mean, I wouldn't adopt Sass just for this reason. I think these things are kind of handy, but not really critical. But in this example, I'm going to, up top, define a color value for pink that theoretically I could use, throughout this style sheet or any other style sheets that I'm using. So I've done that. If you look down to the bottom, I've got a box with the class of pink where the border is set to pink. And so we, do border equals exclamation point pink, and that'll insert the value we defined up top. And, when it gets rendered out to CSS, this is what you'll get. So CSS comments, pretty straightforward. Just a slash, an asterisk, and then the comment. Say again? I think there's a support for a variety of different comments, actually. All right, so to get started, now that you know some kind of basics of Haml and Sass, you need to install the plugin. The plugin actually contains support for both Haml and Sass, so it's just one plugin you have to worry about. It's at svn-catlin.com/haml/tags/stable. I'm going to give you kind of a couple helpful hints to get started. There are some TextMate bundles floating around that will give you syntax coloring for Haml and for Sass. Conveniently, they're not in the same bundle, so you have to kind of dig around on the internet and find them, but they are out there. I'll probably post more information about that on my blog after this talk. So the nice thing is you can kind of install this plugin and just try it out. Take one single template and try doing it in Haml and see what happens. See how it works for you. That's definitely the way that I learned. So if you're going to do Haml, you need to use the .haml file extension if you're not using Edge or Rails 2. That would be instead of .rhtml. And then if you are on Edge or you do plan to use Rails 2.0, you would need to use .html.haml as the suffix for all of your Haml files. Sass is a bit simpler. It's just .sass. I think by default, Sass style sheets live actually in public /style sheets, which is a little bit different. You might think maybe that stuff would live in the views. But it's kind of handy. I personally prefer to put my Sass style sheets just in public /Sass. That way they're kind of not scrolled away inside the style sheets folder. But that's sort of an option you can set in your environment if you want. So if you start trying this and you screw up, it's probably a white space issue. So that takes a little bit of getting used to. But once you do, you'll be good to go.
So is it like 2 spaces?
Yeah, it's 2 spaces. Another thing you'll find is if you maybe came from a PHP background like myself, you might have a tendency to have fairly involved layouts that have a lot of conditional logic. And that's not really great practice to be following to begin with. But you'll find that like having a super complicated layout with a lot of if, else type statements will be pretty painful in Haml. So I recommend kind of moving that stuff into your helpers, which is kind of a good practice anyway. So that's the end of my talk. I definitely encourage you to check out Haml. It's a lot of fun. it actually makes writing views, I think, a lot less laborious and kind of gets it back into something you could actually kind of enjoy doing versus kind of being, real pain. So, yeah, that's it. Any questions?
Have you used the Hamel converter?
I have not used the Hamel converter, but there is one.
The converter walks through your views and changes all your HTML files into Hamel format. Does it work? I don't know. That's what I was asking.
Yeah.
I know it
Yeah.
exists.
Yeah, so there is a converter that will convert our HTML to Hamel. I'm not so sure how that really works, and I guess you probably just run it and pray that your markup is pretty simple.
Does the plugin add the new register for like the engine or like the
MIME type? Or,
engine?
I think it does, yeah. And by the way, it's available in plugin form, but also as a gem if you want to use Hamel in some sort of other application.
How does it work? Does it compile the HTML and CSS every time, or does it only compile and just when it's the notification you compile it?
I believe when you're in development, it's just recompiling all the time, and then I guess it caches when you're in production. Historically, it has been a little bit slower than ERB. It used to be quite a bit slower, but apparently with the newest version, I think it's maybe down to about 30% slower than ERB. But their goals for future versions of the plugin and gem are to get it to a point where it's actually faster than ERB. But it's certainly acceptable. I haven't really noticed any slowdown using it.
You didn't notice any problem when you deploy the application and the views were not updated?
No.
What's the adoption rate on this right now? Like, to me, it just seems like more abstraction. And I don't know. I mean, if the browser is Reddit natively, it seems more palatable to me. But that's kind of
Yeah. So the question was like, what's the adoption rate of people using Hamel? I think that it's certainly popular in certain circles. People doing Rails stuff. I mean, for me, I love hand coding both HTML and CSS, but I think ironically, it's probably better to be writing HTML in Hamel. It's just easier. There's just less drudgery. You're not worrying about making sure all your tags are closed properly or all your, attribute pairs are.
Yeah, my concern would just be that, especially a team of people, and it's hard enough to get everybody. Learning CSS and learning HTML, and then abstracting that another level up so that everybody is learning this and then knowing what that translates to in CSS. It just seems like more abstraction to me. So that would be my only complaint. And then maybe like the white space thing too. I thought we were trying to get away from things that were white space sensitive,
Yeah, I mean, we are in general trying to get away from stuff that's white space sensitive, but it does make sense for markup that is structured as HTML is. So, I mean, for me, I think, it's not right for everybody. I think you'd probably want to be at an intermediate or advanced level in terms of your HTML, coding skills. As well, if you do have a large team and a big app, you're not going to just mandate Hamel one day. But I do think, like I said at the beginning of the talk, that, I was myself very skeptical of Hamel in the sense that, I've learned enough to be working with Rails, how to kind of throw out the way I used to work. Why do I want to mess with this? But there are actually a lot of benefits from it.
I mean, back in the day, we used to do, in Java, we used to do like HTML decorator classes, and it kind of feels like that to me. And then I felt we got the templates, which is supposed to be more native HTML, and that's go back towards almost like, I know this is the same thing. That's just kind of my first.
Sure.
I'll try it.
Yeah.
You don't have to try it.
Well, that's a big consideration when you're working with a team, or if you're working with someone who's not a programmer. I mean, this is very Rails Ruby-centric, and if you're working with a team of people, you need to be thinking about the broader skill set and how you interact with some of these other guys and whether that really works in the bigger picture.
Right, absolutely. I mean, if you have, say, a designer who has no experience with Ruby or Rails, then making them learn Hamel might be a bit much at first.
It might be good for like your personal blog.
Yeah, for something that, or you're only working with a very small team and they're all Ruby guys and it's cool.
Or if you're the dictator of the project,
But one thing.
Yeah.
So one thing that's really nice about it that I didn't really show you a screenshot of or anything, but it just generates really nice nested markup for free once you get used to using it. And that's something that I've always strived for in building web apps, but never quite got there just because generally, generating HTML dynamically would do all sorts of strange things to whitespace, but Hamel seems to kind of figure it out.
Can you use the Sass file and generate CSS and then use the CSS directly?
Yes.
Because, when I'm working with designers, there's no way they're going to use it. And most designers, they just don't want to deal with anything that what they know.
Right. So
can I just use Sass and just generate my CSS and just update the file and let them play with it?
yes. So you can use Hamel and CSS and not use Sass. That's one way of doing it. But then, you could potentially, generate CSS that they can read.
It's a really good back and forth conversion and do it in the editor.
Yeah.
You edit, when you pull up the ERB file, have it look like Hamel and then save back to ERB.
Sure. Well, some of those things might happen depending on how popular Hamel and Sass get.
So yeah, with browsers, all of a sudden, hey, we like this, because theoretically, you could read that. But I doubt that's ever going to happen.
Yeah, yes.
So that's kind of what I'm like. That's my point of kind of skepticism is, well, you're abstracting it again away from what the browser is looking for. So, but I see it. What?
Yeah.
Well, ERB, you can write straight HTML in ERB, but it's kind of meant to be, dynamic. So essentially, you could make an argument, I think, that yes, this is an abstraction, but it's probably a better abstraction than ERB is.
I've already drunk the Hamel Kool-Aid and found it very tasty, but one thing that I've never been able to figure out is how do you get script generate to spit out Hamel files instead of our HTML files?
That's a good question. I would imagine maybe that that's something that maybe you could request people do for the plugin itself.
But when you use Hamel and you use script generate, you manually convert the
Right. Yeah. So if I'm using any scaffold stuff and it generates our HTML, then yeah, I would go ahead and convert that into Hamel.
You can probably really easy to hack the generator, write your generator for that. The generators are pretty simple. I don't think it's a big issue. If you use a lot of scaffolding, you should even do it. It will take you a couple hours.
But too, actually, probably if you think about it, probably the converter that Rob was talking about could do that for you. And those actually, yeah, it's a pretty simple, the scaffold layouts are pretty simple stuff. So probably you can use that converter and have good success with it. So, right. There's not that much to it.
Touch every single view before you consider your scaffold useful.
Right.
Anyway, so.
Another cool stuff that's supported in Erb. If you use Erb, you can use Sass on Hamel.
Yeah, I guess that's really silly.
Yeah, it's called Erb.
Well, no. That too, but more than anything, you use Erb because you need speed, and then you're going to take a 30% speed hit.
You don't use Erb only because of the speed. Okay.
Well, if you,
So,
but usually it's pretty 30%. I think it was much less than that.
that's what they're saying right now.
Okay, so it's probably 40%.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So, any more questions?
For more complicated style sheet stuff, do you have any direct descendants or things like that to support?
Yeah, I mean, I only touched on Sass briefly, but there's a lot more to it. So I would just go check out the documentation. I mean, it supports stuff like creating, pseudo attributes for things like hover on links. It's pretty robust. I mean, this wasn't someone just making up stuff. I mean, it's, as you find kind of like with Rails, it's people, trying to find a better way of doing things. So it really, probably can, deal with most of the things you throw at it.
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.